James, we're here today to talk about Illumina. It's one of our largest holdings, and we've held it for somewhere between 5 and 10 years. Can we start by saying, how did we find the company in the first instance?
Well, at the general level, Catherine, we're particularly interested in industries and companies where there's evidence of accelerating exponential change, hitting points of relevance for the user base, and in this case for humanity, I think it's fair to say. So back in 2010, when I first looked at Illumina, it was obvious that the cost of sequencing was beginning to fall from those extraordinary levels in the initial Human Genome Project to points at which it could become clinically useful. That alerted our attention, and that particularly centered on whether there was an underlying competitive and cultural advantage, which eventually, by late 2011, we decided was the case.
James, can you talk us through the key progression points over the period for which we've held Illumina, going from a cost of gene sequencing in the tens of thousands down to a few $100s a time?
In some ways, it's changed very significantly, as always happens when scale kicks in. But in other ways, the very striking element is just how similar the thesis remains and just how well it's playing out. Really, we can still say that the vision is intact. This was a company which we believed at some point was going to be involved in revolutionising healthcare through sequencing of the human genome. Now, following the logic of exponential change, now that it's become accepted that this is a methodology that has clinical utility and accepted even by the reimbursement systems in America, and as we see the price points falling towards $100 for one human genome, then that story just accelerates from here.
One of the strange things about Illumina is that as it keeps dropping the price of its products, in order to grow, it has to grow its end addressable market. Can you talk us through how that's happening and how the company has planned for that?
Frankly, as you put it, once you started moving below $1,000, and once you started seeing the utility, then I think that changed to a broader audience amongst the pharmaceutical companies. And I think Illumina's attitude, which in turn is part of the culture that we admire, is that they will carry on undercutting themselves, carrying on, in a sense, advancing beyond any of the competitors' ability to go by saying, wait, we can do still better for you, and that will help invent an industry. And if we have to invent an industry, as we may come on to, we will do that for ourselves. Even in retrospect, there was a period when Roche tried to buy Illumina, which was obviously an enormous distraction for the company. But even at that point, they were driving on at this vision. And I think that was one of the admirable features, which was one of the reasons why we supported them during that battle.
Illumina grows through demand for gene sequencing. Can you talk us through the creation of the company called Grail that Illumina undertook?
Let's go back one moment. What was the other side of why we initially thought that Illumina was in a sense necessary or inevitable? It wasn't just this progress that they're making much in advance of Moore's law in driving down the cost, as we've been alluding to. It was that the fundamentals of the American health service in particular, and arguably more internationally, are, as we all know, and very sadly, completely broken. So Illumina moved on from that insight, that problem, to saying, well, where does the main problem in treating most forms of cancer come? The main problem, both in view of mortality, but also in terms of cost, is that they're identified far too late in the cycle. Illumina found that there was something going on when they ran tests for one of the early applications, which was about identifying potentially dangerous tendencies in pregnant women. And they found that sometimes they could go back to the lady concerned and say, look, we can promise you that your child is in very good potential health, but we've got some rather sad news for you, which is that we've seen traces of cancer in the blood samples we take. And from this, the whole hypothesis built out that liquid biopsies, as they're known, can identify cancers at a very early stage, possibly at stage 1 in most cases, which would be transforming in healthcare outcomes and in cost terms. Now, Illumina knew that was going to take a huge amount of work, time, resources, and an extraordinary amount of data. So they decided that they had to push this on with this themselves. And at first they did it through a subsidiary called Grail, as in Holy Grail, which they then decided it was better should be at arm's length. Now, this was exciting for us, both in terms of the commitment and the obvious amount of sequencing that would need to be done associated with it, but also in terms of our access to buy that into the Grail as an unquoted company itself. I think that it's now going to be at least as interesting following how Grail progresses as Illumina overall.
If I can ask you to cast your mind forward 5 years, do you think Illumina will still be focused on oncology? Will be deeply embedded in the healthcare systems in the US, the UK and other developed markets? Or do you think it actually could have spread more broadly still?
In 5 years, I think we should do this film again, because it will then be incredibly interesting at the point to which we've got to. I think that question is in many ways an imponderable. As you know, very often we say that what we invest in is the knowledge that something will happen at some point, but predicting precisely when it will happen is something that we don't feel is very sensible to do, as well as very easy to do. And I think in 5 years' time we'll be absolutely on the cusp of seeing how quickly our own, the American, other healthcare systems can adapt to the very obvious needs. Is there a vision beyond that? I can see you're going to ask that next. Well, yes, because from Illumina's perspective, once you start on that, you will be into a system where effectively sequencing will be an ever-present in our lives.
Thank you very much, James. That's fascinating, and I look forward to picking up this discussion in 5 years' time to see how far we've got down the path of progress. Thank you.